What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So with the release of TOT, we're going to be experiencing in Classic something that the players in OG MoP also experience, although with a little bit more bumpiness, which is a massive change in the philosophy of how like procs work, especially for trinkets. So before I go through my bis list and stuff like that, I'm going to be talking about trinkets a lot and how they proc. So I figured it would be useful to make a video going into detail about this system. What I'm talking about here is RPPM versus ICD. So I have two examples here. Ironically, both of these are from this patch. Given that most of the trinkets swap to RPPM, there's a couple of examples that just randomly use ICD. So we're going to be talking about Volatile Talisman of Shadowpan Assault. This is a Valor trinket, which is actually decent for Resto Shaman, as well as for DPS specs. So the way this procs is just a traditional ICD, which you'll be very familiar with if you've played Classic. You can see here it has a proc effect that has a duration. It has a cooldown and a chance to proc that's just flat. So 15% chance on all your damaging spells to get this 10-second effect, and then it has a 55-second ICD in which it cannot proc. It comes off ICD, and then every spell has a 15% chance flat. It makes things pretty predictable, right? You can just track that ICD, and you can know as soon as it's going to come off cooldown, you're very likely to proc it in the next few globals, which makes things very predictable. And Blizzard, in their wisdom, did not like this design. There's a couple of problems with this. First, again, the predictability. I think they wanted things to be a little bit more random and unpredictable with procs. The second problem with this is the flat chance to proc. This means that you're going to get higher uptime on specs that hit a lot. So, you know, if it's procs on a harmful spell, if you have a bunch of dots on different targets, you're hitting a bunch of times, it's going to proc more reliably right when it comes up ICD. Whereas if you're just casting like Fireball or whatever into the boss every 2 seconds, you're much less likely to proc this quickly. They try to solve this with RPPM, which is a bit more of a complicated mathematical model. I'm going to go into the math here. What RPPM tries to do is to solve both of those problems. Number one, it tries to make procs proc more randomly and less predictably. And secondly, it tries to make it so that no matter how many times you hit the target, it should proc the same amount of times for you as for someone who's much slower. So we can see here, this is Lightning Imbued Chalice. This is one of the healing trinkets, actually kind of a bad trinket for the most part, but good example here. You can see it has a proc, but instead of an ICD, a cooldown, and a proc chance, it just says approximately 5.78 plus haste procs per minute. This plus haste here is interesting. We'll talk about this a little bit later. There were a bunch of changes in MoP, actually in this original TOT patch, because of this plus haste here. Again, we'll talk about that later. So what does this mean? This means that no matter how fast or slow you're hitting the target or healing in this case, you should expect to get 5.78 of this proc every minute. And then of course that's going to be multiplied by your haste for this trinket. For some trinkets, this is not the case. Again, we'll go into that later. So that's a qualitative description of like what we want the math to actually do. How does this actually work out in terms of the formula we're going to be using? This has changed a little bit in retail. You know, there's some updates in Legion, and there's been some small changes over the years, but we're going to be talking about the formula that we use in MoP Classic. First of all, just a description here, our proc chance is going to be 3 things multiplied together. The first is bad luck protection. This is a factor that's designed to make it so that your proc chance will increase if you have gone a very long time, like much longer than expected without getting a proc. The second factor is just your RPPM divided by 60. Our third factor here is time since last procking event. So this is just how long it's been since you healed, if it's a trinket that procs from healing, or did a dot if it's a proc happens from dots, etc. How does this actually work out in the math? So this is the formula here. Our bad luck protection factor is going to be this phrase here, which is kind of complicated, not super readable, honestly, but the gist of this is that if you go 1.5 times the length of your expected chance to proc, so for example, a trinket that has an RPPM of 1, zoom in here, that means you expect to go 60 seconds between each proc, right? Because 1 proc per minute, a minute is 60 seconds. This means that if your last proc is anything between 0 and 90, 90 being 1.5 times 60, it won't affect your proc chance at all. So if we go to 50, if I go to 10, it's always this 16%. But if I go to 91, it's going to creep up. And this is not capped. So if I go all the way to like 500, you can see I can go over 100% chance to proc. Or if I go to something like 2 minutes, you can see my chance to proc here is so high that if I do like a couple of heals, my expected value on procs is going to be over 100%. So you can get like effectively deterministic results if you go quite a long time between procs. Then of course we have our RPPM divided by 60 factor in here. And then our third factor is going to be this time since last procking event. This is designed to, again, get that like normalization effect in there, where if you hit a lot or if you hit a little, you're still going to have the same RPPM. However, in the actual formula, this is capped at 10 seconds. I believe in retail, it's capped a little bit lower than this. And this means that so long as you hit at least once every 10 seconds, you should get your RPPM. But if you hit any less than that, so for example, if you're like a healer that doesn't usually cast damage spells and you have a damage proc trinket and you only hit the boss with a damaging spell every 15 seconds, you will not get that RPPM full value out of your trinket. And so the gist of this factor is basically just as long as you hit once every 10 seconds, you will get your full value. All right, so just to give a quick example to help you visualize this a little bit better, with this model here with an RPPM of 1, if I hit 1 time every 10 seconds, you can see my proc chance is 16.6 repeating. And if I go to 1, it's just 1/10 of that. So if I hit 10 times in 10 seconds, I would have the exact same proc chance. And you can see if I go to 15 seconds, it's just the same. So what does this mean practically for our play patterns? Well, this does relatively successfully fix those weaknesses, right? These procs are going to be pretty random. You're decently likely to get procs close together and far apart. You're decently likely to get even slightly above and below your RPPM with this mathematical model here. And it also does protect you from bad luck, right? If you go a very long time without proccing, this will bump up your proc chance decently. However, 1.5 times your expected proc chance is pretty long, especially for the lower RPPM trinkets, so not hugely reasonable to like game this and get 100% proc chance or something by delaying proccing events. And the fact that the proccing event is capped at 10 seconds means that like if the boss goes immune for 30 seconds or something like that, this bad luck protection will be stacking up, but you won't get like hugely increased proc chance from that. All right, so those are the basics of the formula. Now, if you've been playing Classic at all, you've definitely felt the pain of having to do very long pull timers for long ICD trinkets. And this is actually another big problem that RPPM does solve, which is, again, that problem of the pull timer, potentially like syncing your trinkets with an event, you know, swapping them to put them on ICD early, etc. And how does RPPM deal with that? Well, basically what this does is that as soon as you pull a boss, because there's no ICD, or at least some of the ICDs are just very, very short, what it will do is instead of just on pull setting last proc to 0 and last hit to 0 and just starting from 0, what it will do is it will set the time since the last proc to 2 minutes, and it will set the time since the last proccing event to 10 seconds. So you can see here with like pretty high RPPM trinkets, you can actually quickly get to close to 100% chance to proc on pull. I think 1.33 RPM here is like the break point where any higher than this, you will have a 100% chance to proc. Any lower than this, you will get these sort of like lower, like let's go to 120 here. You can see with a 1 ppm, you get 41% chance. So pretty steep drop off there from 1 to 1.3. But again, 41% is very high. So if you have like 2 or 3 proccing events in the first 2 or 3 globals, you're very, very high expected value to get that proc. So this means your first hit has a very, very high chance to proc. And then how you would expect it to happen is that on your second hit, you know, this is going to go down to 1 second. You're going to get, you know, 1/10 the chance to proc for your next hit and each subsequent hit after that until you get your first proc. However, there is a pretty important and significant bug. It's kind of an interesting history lesson here. If you want to go through some old blog and forum theory crafting WoW days, there's a post here that's interesting. I think this is the guy who found it. I think this bug actually went unfound for quite a long time, if I'm not correct. I wasn't like a huge theory crafter at this point in the game, so I don't actually know. If you do know how this got found, feel free to post it in the comments below. So again, what you would expect is this here, where your first spell is going to have a high chance to proc, and then subsequent spells are going to have that lower chance to proc because that 10 seconds is going to go down to 1. What you actually find in testing is that every subsequent hit until your first proc just has a very, very high chance to proc. So what this bug was doing is when you pull the boss, your last proc was set to 120, your last hit was set to 10, and then what was happening is that this 10 just was not getting reset until you actually proc the trinket the first time. So this didn't matter at all for trinkets that had higher RPPM, things that were like 1.3 and above, because you just had a 100% chance to proc anyways, which is, I think, part of the reason why I didn't really get noticed as much or as quickly, because just a lot of trinkets have this higher RPPM. This also means that something like, you know, a weapon enchant like Jade Spirit that has a 2 RPPM just always procs on pull. So this is mostly significant for trinkets that have a low RPPM. So something like Unerring Vision, which is a trinket I'll talk about later in some videos, somewhat relevant for healers, very, very relevant for DPS. The trinket that gives you a 100% chance to crit for 4 seconds. Very powerful effect, balanced out by having a very low RPPM of 0.62. So this means that like on your first hit, you have a 10% chance to proc. And then if this went down to 1, obviously you'd only have a 1% chance. But if this sticks at 10, you're going to have a much, much more reliable proc in the first few globals of the fight than if this bug didn't exist. And of course, you know, that low RPPM, getting your first proc more quickly is going to increase your uptime. It's going to make it more predictable so that you can get your snapshots with that crit, etc. And the same thing is true for like, you know, row, lots of low RPPM trinkets. From what I can tell, I haven't like thoroughly tested this on PTR or anything just because I can't be bothered, but there's a post on the Classic WoW GitHub that goes through this bug, it documents it, and from what I can tell from this post, it says, you know, we've restored the 10 seconds since last attempt on encounter start, and they also said this restores the behavior where it remained at 10 seconds since last attempt until the first successful proc, which we're okay with at the moment. So again, this bug mostly relevant for these low RPPM trinkets, making them much more predictable to proc on pull. The last thing to mention here is also another little bit of a history lesson that's specific to TOT. So when they first introduced these, you can see this is a list of all the trinkets and the changes to them when they made this big sweeping nerf. Originally, the trinkets would all have their base RPPM and they would all be modified by haste, some of them being modified by haste and crit. So you'd get like, you know, your 0.53 RPPM, and then that would be multiplied by your haste. The problem with this was that they didn't like this double dipping. So for example, like Breath of the Hydra, it procced, you got intellect, that intellect would scale all your spells. Haste would make you cast more spells in the duration, but haste would also make you have more proc. So there was like a double dipping, you know, double, triple dipping thing there. So in Classic, we are not getting these old PPM models. We're getting the post-nerf thing where what they did here is you can see they changed the base RPPM to be higher, and then on proc effects that did sort of double dip, they removed the haste scaling entirely, and a lot of these they also like, you know, reduce the duration and stuff like that. So you can see, you know, Breath, Ushulays, Vision, all these trinkets got that haste scaling removed from the RPPM. However, this removal was not like 100% consistent across the board. You can see some of these trinkets, like Chaye's, actually has a crit modifier to its RPPM, and some of the procs that do not scale, like don't double dip rather with haste, things like Horidons, which just gives you some MP5, or the trinkets that proc healing effects or absorb effects, like Inscribed Bag of Hydra Spawn, Chalice, etc. These actually did retain that haste scaling. A little bit confusing here to have this be inconsistent across items, some scaling with haste, some not, some scaling with crit randomly, etc. So there's no like consistent rule here. Best thing to do is just, you know, check Wowhead or whatever, and it'll tell you, you know, Chalice does scale with haste, this item doesn't scale with haste. And I think overall it's good that we're getting the post changes version of the trinkets. It was a little bit degenerate, causing people to really value haste and want to stack haste heavily, whereas the, you know, post changes versions didn't do that as much. All right, so that's the RPPM system here. How does this affect healers practically? This is going to be mostly relevant for healers that want to wear damage proc trinkets or trinkets that proc off of some effect that you don't normally cast. So in one way, this is like a slight buff, right? Because if you cast damaging spells infrequently but regularly, so something like Holy Priest, where you're casting Solace and that's your only damage spell. Since Solace has a 10-second CD, that means you can get 100% value out of a damage trinket without sacrificing anything. You don't have to cast Smite or some damage spell that's just kind of a waste of mana and globals to get your full value on damage trinkets. Whereas for a healer like Resto Druid that just does not consistently cast damaging spells, this could actually potentially be a bit of a downside, given that if you had an insanely powerful, like just theoretically, let's imagine a super powerful damage trinket that had a very long ICD, but like at a high chance to proc, you could potentially, you know, cast a couple of Wraths or a Moonfire or something to proc that trinket on ICD, and you'd get full value or close to full value out of that. Whereas, you know, a low RPPM trinket, you couldn't do that because you'd have to have a proccing event every 10 seconds, or you'd have to wait an insanely long time for bad luck protection to kick in. To get like that high proc chance, to get that consistent chance to proc, the same way you would with an ICD with a high proc chance. So just a slight change there for healers. For the game overall, I do think this was like a healthy change. I think that having procs be like more random is generally good, just to have gameplay feel a little bit more dynamic. However, it does reduce the like skill expression of tracking your trinket ICDs, knowing when they're going to come off CD so that you can, you know, potentially delay a cooldown, line things up. That is like fun gameplay, but I do think that just like increasing the randomness of your procs was like generally a good thing overall. However, that randomness is also a weakness of the system. It's much more likely with RPPM that you get procs very close together or very far apart. With the ICD high proc chance system, you're pretty consistently going to get that trinket to proc on ICD, as long as you're, you know, a damage spec with a damage trinket and not, you know, cheesing it somehow like healers might potentially. Whereas with PPM, you can obviously proc things much closer together than with ICD trinkets, which can potentially introduce more variance to your damage and healing. Although I think that problem is like not huge, honestly, and I think overall, again, the system was pretty good. And it's why they've kept it in WoW with relatively few changes all the way up until modern retail. All right, so that's my autistic ramble about how RPPM works. Again, this is going to be relevant when I go into my BIS list, which I will be doing very soon. I'm going to go through all the gear, all the trinkets for all the healers. I'll also be making a video to talk about the legendary meta gems, how much they're worth, which ones you should wear on which healers. If you enjoyed the video, send a comment, like, subscribe, etc. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you know a lot more about this than me, which I'm sure some of you do, and you want to do some corrections in the comments, feel free to send them. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.